Well, welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I'm Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. Today's conversation is going to be really interesting. I'm all excited about it. It's going to be about mock composability and actually a new term that you probably haven't heard of, Halo. No, it's not the game or the TV show. Okay, it's something else, and we're gonna be talking about that real soon. It's with Adam Sturrock. He's the VP of Product Marketing at Amplience. So we'll get to that real soon. But before we get started, you know how this goes. I'm going to tell you real quick why you need an account at headlesscreator.com. Go get it. You'll have access not only to all of the live streams, but also all of the on-demand versions that come right after the live streams. Then you'll have access to basically the entire course, plus all of the other courses, including the Content Modeling Weekly, like I said, the Discover Headless tech course. You'll have access to that, which gives you access to all of the podcasts and all of the tutorials in there, plus tons of Headless CMS courses as well, including the Focus on Ampliance, which Adam is part of, and then bootcamp courses. We have weekly tip courses coming out real soon. Stay tuned for that because I'm really excited about that. So lots and lots of cool stuff. All right, having said that, we are ready to start the interview. For those of you watching live, I do want to remind you that you can put questions for Adam in the chat and I'll ask him. But without further ado, welcome, Adam. How are you?
Hi there. Thanks for having me. I'm doing okay. I'm still recovering from COVID, so you'll have to forgive me if I end up coughing or sneezing.
You know, you look and sound great, man. So nobody would have known. So, but sorry to hear that, and I hope you get better real soon. Luckily, we get to work from home, right? So that helps quite a bit nowadays. Okay, real quick, where are you located, first of all?
I am in the northeast of England in a very remote village called Rothbury. It's pretty much almost on Hadrian's Wall. So yeah, that's where I am.
Very cool. We could kind of tell by the accent where you're kind of located, right? I'm in Southern California here, so it's super early in the morning. It's what, tea time over there?
Yeah, 3:30, just gone.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. So the way we got in contact was you posted a really great article about mock composability in the future. Where do we go from there? And you came up with this Halo term, which we're going to get in just a minute, and posted it on LinkedIn, and people will be able to check out the link in the show notes on this. But before we get to all of that, just give us a little bit overview of yourself. How did you get into tech? What did you do prior, to what you're doing today?
Yeah, sure. So back in 2013, I founded a headless e-commerce platform before Headless was really a thing, called Molten. And before that, I used to be a software developer working in an agency building websites on Magento, Shopify, WooCommerce, that kind of thing.
Was it front end or back end, or
a bit of both?
stack?
A lot of full stack sort of PHP. So yeah.
Oh, PHP, I remember that with WordPress.
That's a long time ago. I haven't really touched code in a good, I would say, decade at this point. I know enough to be dangerous, but I wouldn't trust myself with like the modern Jamstack stuff now.
Right, definitely. Yeah, I can totally relate to that. Yeah, I'm a developer, but I'm so far removed from that. I could be dangerous, but that's about it. Mm-hmm. So very cool. So you went from that to Amplience directly, or
it was sort of almost like, I guess directly, indirectly. So I was in Boston up to the point of acquisition of Molten by Elasticpath, and then I came back to the States, to the UK from the States, just at the end or the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and then nobody was hiring. Obviously, at that point, everyone was kind of a bit uncertain as to what was happening. I set up a consulting business for that year, and then just sort of had a lot of different clients interacting, whether that was on the vendor side with folks like Amplience, and also on sort of the consulting side for retailers and brands looking to evaluate different vendors and solutions, and sort of helping sort of be in the middle, helping them through that sort of transition. So I got to see both sides of the world in a sort of a unique position, and over the course of that year, I began to work more and more with Amplience to the point at which I was like working 4 days a week, at which point it's pretty much full time. So I joined Amplience officially January 2021. So I've been at Amplience 18 months now, almost to the day.
Very cool. So why'd you get into tech?
That is a good question. It goes all the way back to like the MySpace days, I guess, of like customizing HTML pages.
Sure.
I had to like draw a thread all the way back, like a very, very long time ago. And it really started from there. And I sort of landed in sort of commerce sort of as something that like obviously a lot of, so it's a big sort of domain and problem space, and it's something that's really interesting to sort of explore. It's got so many different facets. There's a lot of complexity there, and I think I strive on the complexity within that space, especially.
Yeah, definitely. I remember the MySpace days. Definitely. The wonderful, beautiful pages in like black and pink and green, and people just made a total mess
the
of
music
things.
that you can put on there too.
And the music and the little animated GIFs and all that kind of stuff.
It feels like it's making a bit of a comeback from a design standpoint.
I hope not. All right, let's jump into particularly the article you wrote, but let's start by defining some terms, and let's talk about that big bad word, the monolith. What is that? What when we mean monolith, what are we talking about?
So it kind of goes back to that full stack that we were just talking about just before with that PHP sort of monolith. So the front end presentation layer is sort of combined with the back end logic, and it's sort of intertwined inside the code base itself, which is quite difficult to make changes in as a developer, because as you make a change on the front end, you might have to make a change on the back end and vice versa. So if you make a change in one area, it can have catastrophic effects in other areas if you're not quite sure how the code base works, which is a bit of a nightmare to work around. It's good in some ways because you can like get an out of the box experience quite quickly, but if you step outside the bounds of that like cookie cutter like template that you're working with, it gets very difficult very quickly, because it's not really been designed to be extended out in that way. They do have like their extension frameworks, plugins, etc., to try to expose some flexibility, but again, you're working within like the confines of the four walls of what they've set out that you can and can't do.
Including dictating the technology, right?
Like dictating the technology, that's typically proprietary as well. So it's
right.
You can even look at like Shopify, for example, with the liquid templating engine. So that's that sort of thing where they're sort of imposing upon you a lot of design decisions, which at first seem great. You're kind of moving into this, like, I have this like analogy of this prefabricated house. It all looks great on paper, but if you fast forward 5-10 years, it becomes, I don't know if you're familiar with the Winchester house, but it becomes this sort of this huge mansion with like 10 bathrooms. It doesn't make any sense on paper, but it sounds impressive. But you end up with like dozens of plugins and add-ons and customizations that you didn't set out that way, but that's where you end up. So yeah, that's in my head the analogy that I have.
Right, and also, so what are some of the challenges with scalability with, let's say, like a monolith, right? Because it may work for you at the beginning, it may be just perfect. It's got everything I need right now, but then what happens to scalability as you add channels and all of that?
Yeah, if you in any facet, you can scale them vertically, but then as they kind of reach their limitations of, typically you find them having caching strategies in place to kind of get around. It's like slapping a band-aid on of the problems that they have from a scaling challenge from that facet. So if you're getting more traffic and more volume into your website, for example, those caches are there to try to protect your databases from like buckling. Basically, you can throw more money at the problem and get bigger databases, but the problem's never going to go away. Kind of that's how they've been architected. So that caching is kind of a veneer of stability that they put on top of it. And then when you look at use cases, anything else outside of a website, it's typically like not designed for a website. If you look back at a lot of the monolithic commerce platforms and CMS platforms, they were designed before the iPhone even existed. Their code bases go way, way back. And a lot of those design decisions that they made back in like 2000, 2005, or even before that, they've just sort of been rolled forward, and they're having to, even today, sort of be worked on. We still feel the ramifications of some of those decisions.
Right.
Which isn't great. In technology terms, 20 years is like an epoch.
It's a lifetime. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So as we're moving down the progression timeline here, right, we're moving into like microservices. But before we talk about that a little bit, what about coupled and decoupled code? Because I think part of monoliths, the problem is being tightly coupled, right? So can you explain the differences between being tightly coupled and decoupled?
I mean, this goes back to sort of the logic. So you can have, even inside of a monolith, you can try to sort of separate the back end from the front end. but there's even coupling that's happening inside the backend itself. So if you're thinking about from a commerce use case, for example, the checkout process, like a lot of things are channeled through that process. So the product information, the shopping cart, the promotions, tax, shipping, it all kind of gets channeled into this checkout process and outputs an order. It's like a state machine that inputs, you get some outputs. And that can all be really tightly coupled together. And in doing that, it's great because you get something quickly, but then if you need to change any of those specific aspects, that coupling inside of that logic can become quite troublesome for you to sort of work around. So when I think about coupling, whether it's coupled or decoupled, it can exist from a front end to back end. It can also exist inside the back end itself, the dark recesses that you maybe don't think about of what's happening. And that especially a monolithic platform, they make a lot of decisions about how those different pieces of logic work with each other, to the point at which they can be either restrictive or it's a two-sided, double-edged sword. It's good in some ways because you get that out of the box experience, but then when you reach the limitations of that platform, it's very difficult to sort of move forward. So we see like vendors or merchants all the time reaching the limitations of their monolithic platform when they start to look at plugins and the ecosystem that surrounds them, and then the value of that platform begins to diminish over time. I think even in the article that I wrote, I think I even sort of questioned the nature of platforms themselves, and like they act as sort of the framework in which you work, but they can compete with their ecosystems over time as well.
Yeah. So to try to get away from the coupling, the next step up is microservices. So let's talk a little bit about what are microservices, define that, and because this will lead us to the next thing, which is
it's like going from one extreme to another. So for microservices, they're smaller, discrete pieces of functionality. A modern site is typically, if you're using a Mac architecture, it's typically comprised of dozens or hundreds of microservices behind the scenes, each focused on very specific tasks, very small functions. If you sort of take that Puritan view, there's it's great because you have so much flexibility. You can pick specific vendors, specific microservices. You can add your own in there. If you look at the likes of Amazon or Netflix, they're the de facto standard for scale because each microservice can be scaled up independently from one another. Where the challenge lies is how those microservices communicate with one another, and sort of the communication, the interoperability, and the orchestration of those microservices is like the weak link in the architecture pattern. So that's where you see the services, how do they talk to one another, and what happens when something goes wrong inside of one of the services and the other service might not know about it. So you have to bake in redundancy, and how do you fail over gracefully if something bad happens. But you get to have a much more tolerant system for downtime if you can work out those retry policies and redundancy services. So if for example, from a payment gateway standpoint, if the payment gateway is having issues, you could potentially redirect those those payments to a different gateway and sort of avoid the downtime happening in one of the other services. That's in an ideal scenario. Obviously, that's when things work well, but there are a lot of times when things don't quite work out.
And you have to do that in your planning, right? You gotta go, hey, this is critical infrastructure, so we've got to have a fallback, a backup to this thing.
Yeah, you typically have architects that are there before you even implement, sort of planning out the system architecture and going through all the nuts and bolts of all those granular details that are happening. Because one tiny design decision in that microservice stack can send something tumbling that you're sort of not even aware of until you hit production.
Right. And so I can think of some challenges with microservices. For example, if something goes down and a microservice depends on another microservice, right? That microservice can go down. One company blames the other. It's not us, it's them.
It's very difficult for a merchant to figure out sort of who is at fault.
Right.
You can't just turn to your monolithic vendor anymore that was doing everything. Which is that is one of the challenges of microservices. It can lead to sort of a domino effect.
Right, definitely. I mean, obviously positives and negatives in every technology, right? Okay, cool. So the next step up from there, now we're talking about MACH. So let's define MACH. Most people probably watching know this, but still, let's define it and let's go through it.
I feel like is it the Dracula character out of Sesame Street, like we're going through the numbers and the letters. so MACH. So we have like lots of acronyms in the technology space. MACH is microservices, API first, cloud native, and headless. So it takes the microservice concept of like breaking up your backend into smaller discrete functions. API first, which is in a lot of ways very similar to headless. Headless separating the backend from the front end. API first, obviously the microservices have to talk with one another and the outside world. And cloud native, I almost feel like is a bit of a de facto thing at this point in terms of how we deliver services online. But we don't we don't self-host anymore. We rent services from Amazon or Microsoft or Google. And that's a better way to scale your systems rather than manually doing it yourself on-prem and dealing with that downtime. So it's more distributed.
Now, I think with API first, what's important to make sure people understand, it doesn't mean that the service has an API. It means that the service was written as an API first, and any tools they provide you are written using their own API, which you have access to as well. It's not a monolith that now has an API on top of it, and now it's API first. That's not API first, right?
It goes back to exactly. It goes back to the design principles of the service itself.
Exactly.
So a monolith is typically expose APIs as a band-aid bridge out towards flexibility to try to cater to some use cases. But again, the nuances exist when you get into the details of, does it do something in a specific way? Does it have some strange behavior that you're not anticipating? Because you're creating an outside bridge to the outside world from the inside of this platform, which you have no idea how it actually, maybe you don't know how it even operates internally. So you can still have like weird issues with like debugging and figuring out like, why am I getting a weird response from this API? Because it's going into this black box you can't see inside.
As an example, most headless CMSs, including you guys, they will provide a editor experience which uses an API that we have access to as well. So we're all using the same API basically.
Yeah, I think at this point, like APIs are sort of consumed the world. Exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, let's get dozens of them every day.
So continue on with the Sesame Street thing here. Composability. Let's talk about that, because that's really the next level. I'm part of Uniform. We're big on that, obviously, as well. But let's talk about composability.
So it kind of goes, it's almost like a pendulum swing of like one extreme from monoliths to microservices on the other end, super extreme. And then composability is trying to bring some balance back towards the middle, like establishing some common ground. Like it gets rid of the sizeism of microservices, because like if you have hundreds of microservices or thousands, that's like too many to really figure out and control. And composability really brings in the concept of package business capabilities. These are bundles of features and functionality that are designed around specific use cases, specific business units. So like a PIM, for example, is focused around the merchandiser and what they need to do in their day jobs, as an example. So it sort of removes that sizeism. It's not quite as large as a monolith, but it's somewhere in that. It's almost like the Goldilocks analogy of like, hopefully it's just the right size.